The letter arrived on a Thursday morning in the second week of November, and it arrived too late. Cecily Ravenswood, Duchess of Aldermere, received it in the small parlor she had claimed as her own at Aldermere House. Not the formal receiving room with its ceiling of gilded plasterwork and its chairs arranged like sentries, but the low-ceilinged room at the back of the east wing, where the windows faced the kitchen garden and the light came in sideways in the afternoon. Gold and quiet. She had chosen it herself, 6 months after her marriage to the late Duke, because it was the only room in the house that did not feel like a stage. The letter was sealed with wax she recognized at once. She had pressed that seal herself, in another life. She held it a long moment without opening it, her thumb resting on the impression, her breathing even. Then she set it on the desk beside her correspondence tray, placed her pen parallel to the tray's edge, and went downstairs to meet her steward. She did not open it until evening. His name was Edmund Forrest. The room had not forgotten that, even if the room had not known it before this morning, for rooms, Cecily had come to understand, absorbed what their inhabitants did not say. She had not spoken his name in 2 years. She had not permitted herself to. Sitting now in the fading November light, the fire small and steady behind her, she read the letter slowly, and when she finished, she folded it along its original creases and returned it to the desk and sat a long while with her hands in her lap. Edmund Forrest was alive. He was coming home. He had been held in a French prison these 18 months, delayed before that by a campaign in the peninsula that had gone longer than anyone in London had been told. He was sorry. He did not know, could not have known, that she had waited through the first winter in diminishing hope, and then, in the spring, accepted the Duke of Aldermere's proposal because her uncle had made the alternative clear, and because the Duke himself had been kind, and because she had believed, finally, that Edmund was gone. He was not gone. He was coming home. He expected her. Cecily sat with the letter and the fire, and did not allow herself to feel anything yet. Feeling, she had learned, could wait. Duty and clear sight could not. She had been Miss Cecily Hartfield once, a solicitor's daughter from Gloucestershire with a decent education, a small portion that would have kept her in modest comfort had it not been diminished by her father's final illness and a private understanding with Edmund, second son of the late Baron Forrest, who had gone to the peninsula with the army because it was the only way a second son with more honor than fortune could build something worth offering her. The understanding had been made without witnesses, without a formal engagement, without any document a court would recognize. It had been made in her father's garden on a warm evening in June, 3 years ago, with no one present but the two of them, and the sound of her father's bees in the lavender. The garden was not hers now. The house was not hers. The bees, she supposed, still worked the lavender for whoever had purchased the property. What was hers was Aldermere. The late Duke had been 64 years old and had carried his age well. He had not been unkind. He had been clear with her from the beginning about the terms of their arrangement, which he called, with a dry precision she had come to respect, a practical alliance between his surplus and her competence. He had 2 daughters from his first marriage, both settled. He had a nephew who would eventually inherit, and for whom he felt the careful, honest indifference one might feel toward a distant creditor. He needed someone to manage the household, to occupy the position correctly, to ensure that Aldermere ran with the quiet efficiency that his declining health could no longer sustain. She had needed a life that was not dependency. She had given him 14 months. He had died in September, 5 weeks before Edmund's letter arrived, and left her with the dower arrangements, the house in town, and a title that the season would spend a great deal of energy deciding what to do with. She had not had time, yet, to decide what she thought of any of it. She was 23 years old, widowed, and in possession of more security than she had ever imagined for herself. She was also, as of this morning, the woman a living man believed was still waiting for him. If you find yourself still sitting at the edge of a story like this one, you already understand something of what comes next. Stay, if you will. She asked her housekeeper, Mrs. Grover, a forthright woman of 50 with an instinct for the unspoken, to have the gray receiving room prepared. Not the parlor, not anything intimate. The gray receiving room, with its formal chairs and its portrait of the previous Duchess above the mantel, because Cecily intended to speak clearly, and she would do it in a room that demanded clarity. Edmund arrived on a Friday afternoon, unannounced in the way that men who have been at war tend to arrive, as though the world ought to have been paused in their absence, and not have done anything inconvenient in the interval. Cecily heard the carriage on the gravel from the upper hall. She was wearing a gown of dark gray wool, because she was still formally in mourning, and she had not changed it for the occasion. The gown was accurate to her circumstance. That was enough. She was already in the gray receiving room when he was shown in. He looked different. He had always been handsome in a lean, angular way, with light eyes and a quality of attention that had once made her feel, when it was directed at her, as though the rest of the room had gone slightly out of focus. He looked harder now, and thinner, and there was something in the set of his shoulders that had not been there before. A bracing. The way a person braces who has learned that comfort is a conditional arrangement. He had been in prison for 18 months. She did not know what that had been. He saw her standing by the window, and something moved across his face. Relief and recognition, and a tenderness she remembered clearly. Cecily, he said, and the word was exactly as she had feared it would be. She had his voice in her memory still. She had kept it there, precisely, because she had believed she would never hear it again. And something in her had not been willing to let it go entirely. Hearing it now, in this room, with the portrait of the previous Duchess watching from above the mantel, was its own kind of difficulty. Mr. Forrest, she said, please sit down. He was still. He looked at her for a moment, at the gray gown, at the room, at the house around them, arriving at the understanding gradually, and then, when he had arrived, going very still in a different way. Cecily, he said again, quieter this time. I am glad you are alive, she said, and meant it, completely, without apology. Please sit down. There are things I must tell you, and I would prefer to tell them properly. She told him properly. She did not soften it or deflect into sentiment. She told him what had happened. Her father's illness and death, the depletion of her portion, her uncle's ultimatum, the Duke's offer and her acceptance, the marriage in February, the Duke's own death in September. She told him that their private understanding had been made in good faith, and that she had honored it as long as she could. Longer, perhaps, than good sense had recommended. But she had been 21, and very much without alternatives. And she had loved him, and had not been willing to release what she was not certain was gone. Edmund sat with his elbows on his knees and his eyes on the floor while she spoke. His jaw was tight. She could see the muscle in it. When she finished, he looked up. You are the Duchess of Aldermere, he said. Yes. He died in September, 5 weeks ago. He was quiet a moment. I cannot undo any of this, he said. No, she said. None of it can be undone. I wanted you to hear it from me, plainly, rather than from someone who would not tell it accurately. She paused. I am sorry, Edmund. I am genuinely sorry. I thought you were dead. I know, he said. And then, after a silence that sat between them like something solid. So did I, for a time. She did not ask him what that meant. She had not earned the right to ask him what that meant, and he had not offered it. They sat in the gray room with the formal chairs and the portrait and the dying afternoon light until the fire needed attention. And then Cecily called for Mrs. Grover, and Mrs. Grover came, and Edmund rose, and they said their farewells with a correctness that was, in its own way, its own kind of grief. She expected that to be the last of it. She was wrong, of course, but she would not know that until the following week. The season's formal functions had not yet resumed. London in November was still stretching its limbs after the summer recess, and Cecily had little appetite for society in her mourning period regardless. She had, however, obligations that could not be indefinitely deferred. The Countess of Braymore's charity collection for the Veterans Relief Fund, which had been organized before the Duke's death, and which bore her name as patron. It would have been an insult to withdraw, and an insult to the men who had served, and so she attended. The collection was held at the Braymore Townhouse, a moderate gathering of perhaps 40 persons in the long drawing room, and Cecily arrived with her companion, Mrs. Aldous, a widow of 40 who had served the late Duke's household before, and whom Cecily had found precise, honest, and easy to trust. They had been there perhaps 20 minutes when Cecily became aware, by the subtle reordering of attention that moves through a room when something unexpected enters it, that he was present. She had not known he would be there. She was not certain he had known she would be there. He was standing near the window with 2 other men she did not recognize, army men she thought from their carriage, and he did not see her immediately. When he did, his face did something that she catalogued carefully, and then set aside, because this was not the gray receiving room, and she had no means of addressing whatever that expression contained with 40 other people in attendance. The Countess of Braymore, Lady Marjorie Halloran, was a woman of 60, with a bright, exacting interest in the social arrangements of any room she occupied. She had been watching Cecily with this interest ever since the Duke's death, calculating what the widowed Duchess represented in terms of the season's shifting architecture. Cecily had noted the calculation and found it neither threatening nor offensive. It was simply what Lady Halloran did, and she did it with a kind of professional thoroughness that was almost admirable. Lady Halloran found her within 10 minutes of Edmund's arrival. "My dear Aldermere," she said, with the particular warmth that indicated she had information and intended to deploy it. "You know Mr. Forrest, I think. I understand he was recently released from French captivity. A notable account. The men are saying his regiment believed him lost." "I knew his family slightly," Cecily said, which was accurate as far as it went. Lady Halloran's eyes moved between them, efficient and bright. "He is much recovered, I think, for his ordeal. Though I understand he has no present establishment in town, and his elder brother's estate is in Northumberland, which is hardly convenient." She said it the way one says things one intends to be repeated. "A second son returned from the war. The season will have to decide what to make of him. I expect he will manage the season's opinion without much difficulty," Cecily said. This was observed later by Mrs. Aldous to have been precisely the wrong thing to say. Cecily had said it because she meant it, and she was not yet in the habit of computing every sentence for its social velocity. She was learning. She had been learning for 2 years. But Aldermere's wife had been a more settled position than Aldermere's widow. And widowhood, she was discovering, was its own curriculum. Edmund crossed the room to speak to her before she had quite resolved whether to approach him first. "Your Grace," he said, and the title was correct and careful, and carried something inside it that she could not name. "Mr. Forrest, I did not know you would be here." "Nor I you." He was standing at the precise distance propriety required, which was far enough that she could breathe without catching the cold air that still seemed to live in the wool of his coat. "How are you?" It was such a small question for the size of what it contained. She answered it honestly. "Well enough. Managing. You look well." She knew she did not look well in the way that people who are managing often do not look well. She looked correct, and correct was not the same thing. She did not say this. "You also," she said. And this was somewhat truer. He had recovered color since the receiving room, and the bracing in his shoulders had relaxed slightly, as though the company of other people had reminded him that bracing was voluntary. Lady Braymore's collection concluded with a brief address and the formal presentation of the charitable contributions. Edmund gave generously. Cecily noticed because she was standing near enough to observe the amount before the secretary recorded it. It was more than he could easily afford, by her estimate of second sons returned from long service. She noted this also. She was noting a great many things about him, and she was doing it without wanting to. And she was not entirely pleased with herself about either tendency. She thought about that on the ride home. She thought about it again the following morning, when a calling card arrived. He came twice more that week, once to call formally, which she received in the gray drawing room because she was still not ready to give him the parlor, and once by chance at the lending library on Cork Street, where she was returning 3 volumes, and he was, apparently, attempting to reconstitute a reading life. The lending library was small, and the shelves were close, and they stood near each other in the natural geography of the space longer than was strictly necessary, debating, without deciding, the merits of a periodical that neither of them had read. She had not laughed in 2 years. Not genuinely. Not the kind of laugh that rises before you can examine it. She laughed in the lending library at something he said about the periodical's tendency to describe Waterloo in increasingly extravagant terms with each subsequent issue. The laugh surprised her more than it surprised him. He looked at her when she laughed, not as though it were striking, but as though he were simply very glad to see it. She walked home in the thin November light feeling unsettled in a way she did not have a name for, and told Mrs. Aldous nothing about it, and sat with her correspondence for the rest of the afternoon without attending to any of it. The Duke of Aldermere's nephew arrived in London the following Monday. His name was Mr. Gerald Aldermere, who used the family name, which was his right by courtesy, though he held no title of his own, and would not until the succession was formally processed. He was 38 years old, broad-faced, with the kind of confidence that comes from having been told since childhood that something large would one day belong to him. That something was now close, and he had come to London to manage the proximity. He called on Cecily with his wife, a pale, thin woman who carried herself as though she were already the mistress of the house, and found the current occupant an inconvenient delay. His wife said very little and managed to convey a great deal. Cecily received them correctly and offered tea and said nothing that could be construed as either encouragement or impediment, because neither was indicated. Gerald was pleasant. She had never found him anything other than pleasant, in the same way she found certain pieces of furniture pleasant, adequate for their function, not interesting beyond it. He congratulated her on her stewardship of the estate during his uncle's decline. He asked about the annual accounts in a tone that was not quite proprietary, but was aiming toward it. He said at the door, as he and his wife were leaving, "You will find, I expect, that the season looks rather different for a woman alone in your position." He said it with the smile of a man who means well, in the way that men who are about to become inconvenient often do. Cecily closed the door after them and stood in the hall for a moment. He meant it kindly, Mrs. Aldous said from behind her. I know, Cecily said. That is what concerns me. She was not frightened of him. She was not frightened of much, as a practical matter. She had buried her father, and waited out a war, and contracted a marriage with a clear head, and managed an estate of 4,000 acres, and navigated her first season as a Duchess at 22, and she had done all of it without what most women in her position would have considered the necessary preparation. Frightened was not the word. Watchful was the word. The formal season would not resume until January. Gerald and his wife would spend the interval maneuvering. Lady Halloran and her counterparts would spend it talking. The solicitors would spend it reviewing documents and corresponding with each other in the deliberate, expensive manner of solicitors. And Edmund would spend it somewhere in London, reconstituting the outlines of a life that had been interrupted for 3 years, with an army half-pension and a brother's goodwill and whatever he could make of himself before February. She found herself thinking about the army half-pension more than was reasonable. She corrected this. The invitation to Lady Pemberton's winter salon arrived the second week of December, which was unusual. Lady Pemberton's salon was not generally a winter institution, preferring the social density of spring. The invitation was extended to Cecily, and in a move she recognized as deliberate placement, also listed Gerald and Mrs. Aldermere among the expected guests. Edmund was not listed. She did not expect him to be. Lady Pemberton had not yet decided what he represented in the current social architecture, and Lady Pemberton did not include people she had not yet decided about. But Edmund had been invited by Lord Pemberton's younger brother, who had served in the Peninsula and owed Edmund a considerable personal debt of the kind that has nothing to do with money. And so he was present. Cecily arrived first. She was wearing a gown of deep gray with narrow black trim, still mourning technically, though the shade was lighter than November had allowed, and she accepted a glass of wine she did not drink and stood near the fire because the room was cold at the edges. Mrs. Aldous was beside her. Gerald and his wife arrived 15 minutes later. Gerald came directly to Cecily with the assurance of someone practicing a rite, and his wife remained at his side with the same practiced stillness, and they talked about the estate's winter accounts, and Cecily answered clearly and gave nothing she was not required to give. Lady Pemberton circulated. The room filled. Edmund arrived late. He came in from the hall with a quiet that was particular to him, not apologetic, but simply unhurried, and he found a position near the door and did not immediately cross the room. He had a glass of wine and appeared to be speaking with Lord Pemberton's brother, but his attention, Cecily was almost certain, was not entirely on the conversation. Lady Halloran reached Gerald first, which Cecily observed from across the room. She could not hear what was said. She saw Gerald's expression shift, from pleasant to something more calculated, and she saw Lady Halloran's fan move in the particular pattern it made when she was not saying a thing directly. She saw Gerald look at her, and then at Edmund, and then back at Lady Halloran. She had wondered how long it would take for someone to assemble the information correctly. 12 days, it appeared. Lady Halloran crossed to her next. "Aldermere," she said, with the warmth of a woman who is about to be instructive. "I hear you knew Mr. Forrest before the war. A family connection." "A slight one," Cecily said. "Yes." Lady Halloran's eyes moved toward Edmund and back again in the way of a person doing a calculation in public. Gerald was asking after it. He found it interesting that Mr. Forrest has been calling. "Mr. Forrest has been calling on several houses, I believe," Cecily said. "He has a great many friends from his service." "Of course," Lady Halloran said. "Of course." She smiled with the portion of her face that corresponded to the word's literal meaning. "It is simply that a widow in your position, one must be careful, Aldermere, of perceptions. Gerald is very attentive to such things, as I understand it. His uncle's memory, and all that. He would not wish to see the family name associated with anything imprudent. She said it gently. She said it as though it were concern. She was, Cecily understood, delivering a message. I appreciate Mr. Aldermere's attentiveness to his uncle's memory, Cecily said, as I am sure you will tell him. Lady Halloran departed, satisfied with herself. Cecily set down the wine-glass she had not drunk from, and breathed slowly, and considered what to do. Not whether to do anything. That was not a question. The question was what? Precisely. And in what order? And at what cost? Edmund was watching her from across the room. She could see it without looking directly at him. She had always been able to feel his attention when it was on her, which had been a source of considerable happiness when she was 21, and had become, in the intervening years, simply something she had learned not to act on. Gerald appeared at her left. A fine room, he said. Lady Pemberton has good taste, Cecily agreed. I was speaking with Lady Halloran, he said, in the tone of a man who has decided to be direct, which for Gerald meant being direct in the way of someone who believes they hold all the cards. She tells me Forrest has been calling quite regularly. He has called twice, Cecily said. On both occasions, with complete propriety. I am sure, Gerald said. I meant no offense. I simply wish to say that you are still in mourning, Cecily. My uncle's widow. I think you understand that there are expectations attached to that position, and that the season will draw its own conclusions. He paused. Forrest is a second son without establishment. He was involved with you, before the marriage. People remember these things. She looked at him. She kept her face very still. I appreciate your concern, she said. I only want what is best for the family, he said, and seemed to believe it. He moved away. Cecily stood for a moment with the warmth of the fire at her back and the cold of the room at her face, and something cold and very clear in her chest. She was a duchess. She was 23 years old, widowed, in possession of a dower arrangement and a title and an estate that would eventually pass to a man who had just warned her about the impropriety of receiving callers. She had done nothing wrong. She had done nothing that was not within her complete right. And she had been warned anyway, by proxy, through Lady Halloran, and then in person, because he understood that warning women through channels and then in person was more effective than either approach alone. She felt the anger, briefly, like a hand placed flat against her sternum. Then she put it away. Edmund appeared beside her. He had crossed the room without fanfare, as was his way, and was standing at her right shoulder with his wine-glass and his quiet. And he said, very low, "Are you all right?" "I am always all right," she said, which was true in the way that most half-truths are true. "I saw Gerald speaking to you." He was expressing his concern for propriety. A pause. "Because of me." She did not answer immediately. "Because of the situation," she said. "Which is not your fault, and is not mine, and is simply the situation." He was quiet for a moment, and she could feel him deciding something, the way she had always been able to feel him deciding things, not the content of the decision, but the fact of it, the moment of internal resolution that came before action. "Cecily," he said, in a voice that was different from the receiving room and different from the lending library, and that she recognized, from a long time ago, as the voice he used when he intended to be fully honest with her. "Not here," she said. "Not now." He said nothing more. She stayed another 40 minutes for form's sake, took her leave of Lady Pemberton, and did not look at Edmund when she went. She opened the parlor to him the following afternoon. She had not planned to. She had planned to receive him in the grey drawing room, which was the correct choice, which maintained the appropriate register. She had told Mrs. Grover the drawing room, and then, when Edmund was announced, she had said quietly, "The small parlor, please." And Mrs. Grover, who had noted a great many things in 24 years of service, and knew when to simply nod, had nodded. The parlor was small, as she had said. The windows faced the kitchen garden, bare in December, and the light came in low and pale, not gold in this season, but a thin, honest gray. There were 2 chairs near the fire, and a table with a chess set that had belonged to the late Duke, and which Cecily used primarily to hold correspondence she had not yet filed. Edmund sat where she indicated. She sat across from him. The fire was small and steady. "I need to say something," he said, "and I would rather say it here than in a drawing room." "Then say it," she said. He was quiet for a moment, and she waited, and the fire made its small sound. "I came back to London expecting to find you as I had left you," he said. "I want to be clear that I do not hold you responsible for anything that happened in my absence. You made a reasonable decision with the information you had. I know that." "Yes," she said. "But I also—" He stopped. He started again. "When I was in that prison, in the first months before I understood how long it would be, I thought about the garden. Your father's garden. The evening in June. I thought about it a very great deal. The bees and the lavender." She did not say this. "I thought about you," he said plainly, the way he always spoke when he was being direct. "I did not stop. In 18 months I did not stop. And I came home and you were. You are a duchess. And you are managing an estate. And you are sitting here being careful and correct and entirely reasonable. And I find that I am not able to simply take my leave and allow the situation to resolve into distance." She looked at him. The fire moved between them. "Edmund," she said, and his name, which she had not permitted herself aloud in 2 years, felt like a door opening. "I know what I am," he said. "I am a second son with a half pension and my brother's goodwill, and no establishment and no prospects that a reasonable person would rate highly. I know what you are. I know the season will have a great deal to say about all of it. I know Gerald will have a great deal to say about all of it. I am not asking you to do anything unreasonable." "What are you asking?" she said. "I am asking," he said, "if there is anything left. Of the garden. Of the evening." He paused. "Of you deciding whether I am worth the difficulty." The thin December light lay across the chess set, and the correspondence and the arm of her grey chair. She sat with his question, and did not answer it immediately, because she had not been asked anything of the kind in a long time, and she wanted to answer it honestly, and she needed a moment to determine what honesty required. She did not love him the way she had at 21. She had been 21, and he had been there, and she had been, in the way of people who have been lonely, and who have found someone who seemed to understand them, wholly and immediately certain. That certainty had a different shape now. It was quieter. It was steadier. It had survived 2 years of being archived in a place she did not visit, and it had not diminished, which seemed to her to be more significant than the first, bright, unexamined version of it. "I think," she said carefully, "that there is something left. I think it would require very careful navigation for both of us. I think Gerald will be unpleasant about it, and Lady Halloran will be vocal about it, and the season will have opinions." She paused. "I find that I am not moved by any of those objections." He let out a breath. "I am moved," she said. By the question of whether you, having been through what you have been through, and having come back to find everything different, are certain of what you want. Not what you came home expecting. What you want now. From this actual situation. He looked at her for a long moment, and she held the look steadily. Because she was the Duchess of Aldermere, and she had learned in 2 years that steadiness was the thing she had, and it was enough. You, he said simply. I want this. You, as you are now. The drawing room and the gray gown and the chess set and whatever the season decides to say about it. She was quiet a moment longer, holding the weight of it. Then we will manage the season, she said. There was a softness in his face that she recognized. She did not look away from it. They did not resolve anything else that afternoon. There was nothing to resolve. Not yet. No decisions to make. No documents to sign. No conversation to have with him or anyone else. There was only the parlor and the fire, and a long conversation that moved from the estate's winter condition to the veterans' collection to the periodical they had argued about in the lending library. And the afternoon went to evening without either of them noting it particularly. Mrs. Aldous knocked at 6 o'clock. Edmund rose. He was at the door when he turned back, and the look he gave her was the one from the lending library. Not calculated, simply glad. The garden, he said. In June, if you are willing. It was an absurd thing to say in December in London, and she knew exactly what he meant. We will see, she said, which was not a refusal, and which he understood. Lady Pemberton's salon had done what such salons do. It had produced conversation. By the following Monday, the information that the Duchess of Aldermere and Edmund had a prior connection was general knowledge among the sort of people who kept themselves informed, and the further information that he had called at Aldermere House was additionally circulating. He called the same Monday morning, without his wife, and was received in the formal drawing-room. He was less pleasant than before. He was not unpleasant, too careful for that. But the pleasantness had contracted, the way a room contracts when a window is shut against weather. He talked about propriety at length. He talked about the late Duke's reputation and the family name. He said, at the end of a long sentence, I would not want it said that you were conducting yourself in a manner that reflected poorly on the title. No, Cecily said. I would not want that said either. I have not given anyone cause to say it. Forrest's calling repeatedly might be considered a concern. Mr. Forrest is a gentleman recently returned from service at considerable personal cost, she said, and her voice was level, the way she had trained it to be level in situations that required it. He called twice, in daylight, with my companion present, and stayed less than 2 hours on each occasion. If the season finds that objectionable, the season may speak to me directly, and I will address its concerns. Gerald looked at her, recalibrating. I am not your ward, Mr. Aldermere, she said. I am your uncle's widow, which is a different thing. I wish you good morning. He left. Mrs. Aldous appeared in the doorway. Well done, she said. He will not take it well, Cecily said. No, Mrs. Aldous agreed. He will go to Lady Halloran. Yes, Cecily said. I expect he will. She spent the afternoon writing correspondence and did not think about Gerald except when she could not help it. The Duke's solicitor, Mr. Prewett, had requested a meeting for Thursday regarding the dower arrangements and certain questions about the estate's management through the transition period. She had written to confirm it. Mr. Prewett was a careful man of 70 who had served the Aldermere estate for 30 years and who regarded Cecily with a professional respect that was, she understood, relatively rare, and which she had earned by understanding the estate's accounts more thoroughly than his previous instructions had anticipated. She trusted Mr. Prewett. She did not trust him. On Thursday, she received Mr. Prewett in the study. He had brought with him certain documents pertaining to the dower settlement, and certain other documents he described as having come to his attention in the course of reviewing the estate accounts. He set these before her without commentary and waited while she read them. They contained evidence, not conclusive but thorough, that he had been drawing from a secondary estate fund through a solicitor in Bristol, authorized by a codicil Cecily had not been shown at the time of the Duke's death. The amounts were not enormous. The pattern of withdrawal was. She read it twice. "When did you find this?" she said. "2 weeks ago," Mr. Prewett said. "I wished to be certain before I brought it to you." "And the codicil?" "Is of uncertain validity," he said. "I am of the opinion that a court would find it deficient. However, I wished your instruction before I proceeded." She sat with the documents for a moment. "Proceed," she said. The Thursday at Lady Pemberton's salon arrived. Lady Pemberton had organized a second event, which was itself a statement of something, and Cecily attended with Mrs. Aldous, and Edmund attended at Lord Pemberton's brother's invitation, and Gerald did not attend, which was either coincidence or strategy, and she suspected strategy. Lady Halloran was present. Lady Halloran was always present. She had determined by the quality of her greeting that she had heard from Gerald, and she had revised her assessment of the situation, and she was watching to see what Cecily would do. What Cecily did was nothing extravagant. She moved through the room correctly. She spoke with Lord Pemberton and his brother, and a Mrs. Thornton who was involved with the Veterans Collection, and who asked sensible questions about the spring effort. She accepted a glass of wine she did not drink. Edmund was across the room. They spoke twice, briefly, in ways that were unremarkable. She was aware of him in the peripheral register that she had stopped trying to suppress. Lady Halloran reached her at the evening's midpoint. "Gerald has spoken to me," she said without preamble, which was a measure of how seriously she was taking it. "I imagined he might," Cecily said. "He is concerned about the dower arrangements," Lady Halloran said. "He has expressed the view that a widow who forms an attachment too quickly after bereavement might call into question the prudence of the provisions made for her." "Does he mean to contest the dower?" Cecily said. Lady Halloran blinked, once, which was as close as she came to expressing surprise. "I do not know that he meant to go so far. I believe he wished to indicate that it would be advisable." "Lady Halloran," Cecily said, and her voice was steady and clear. "Mr. Prewett brought certain documents to my attention on Thursday. I do not intend to discuss them here, because this is Lady Pemberton's salon, and Lady Pemberton has nothing to do with any of it. If Mr. Aldermere would like to have a conversation about prudence and propriety and dower arrangements, he is welcome to have it with my solicitor." The room, or the portion of it nearest them, had gone slightly quieter. Lady Halloran looked at her for a long moment. "You have changed," Lady Halloran said. And this time there was no calculation in it, only something almost like admiration. "I have had occasion to," Cecily said. She turned from Lady Halloran and found Edmund at her elbow, as he had been at Lady Braymore's, as he had been every time she had needed someone to simply be present without asking her to perform anything. He was looking at her with the expression from the parlor. "Admirably done," he said very quietly. "I have not done anything yet," she said. "I have simply said what I intend to do." "I know," he said. "That is the admirably done part." There was a warmth in her face that she recognized and did not try to manage. She looked at him steadily, and he looked back, and the room continued around them. It was Lord Pemberton's brother, standing nearby and apparently unashamed of having overheard most of it, who said that Miss Hartfield had always been the most sensible person in any room she entered. It was the only thing Forrest ever said about her that I thought was underselling it. Edmund looked at him. Miss Hartfield, his friend said, is now the Duchess of Aldermere, and she appears to me to be doing very well at it. She is, Edmund said simply, the way he said all simple things. The room had reformed around this. Lady Halloran, who missed nothing, had absorbed it and was already beginning the process of revising her construction of the situation. Mrs. Aldous, at the far side of the room, looked at Cecily with an expression that was professionally neutral and privately quite warm. His response to Mr. Prewet's letter arrived the following week, and was, as expected, defensive and then conciliatory in quick succession. The codicil was not challenged. The withdrawals were, after some correspondence, attributed to a misunderstanding and repaid. Gerald and his wife left London before Christmas, and Cecily did not hear from them again before January. She did not gloat. She had not wanted to ruin Gerald. She had wanted him to stop. He had stopped. January came in cold and bright, with the particular quality of light that London produces when the sky has been washed clear by frost, and Cecily opened the parlor windows for the first time in weeks and let the cold air move through the room and sat in it for a while, breathing. Edmund called that afternoon. He was admitted by Mrs. Grover, who had stopped announcing him with any particular formality 3 visits ago, and he found Cecily at the window with the chess set and the cold air and a cup of tea going cool at her elbow. And she did not pretend she had not been expecting him. They sat by the fire, which she built up against the cold, and talked for 2 hours about nothing important, and several things that were. He had found a position, he told her. Not army, not a second son's usual range of unexciting options, but through Lord Pemberton's brother, a role in the administration of one of the veterans' relief funds, which suited him in ways he did not fully articulate, but which she understood. It was useful work. It was work that matched what he was. I will not be established in any way that the season would recognize quickly, he said. I want to be honest with you about that. I was not looking for the season's recognition, she said. You will have to manage it anyway, he said. Being what you are. Being what I am, she agreed. I am rather more capable of managing it than I was at 21. He looked at her, and the warmth in his eyes was specific and old, and still there, the way certain things remain when you come back to them after having been afraid they would be gone. June, he said. June, she said. It was not a proposal. It was not even a declaration, precisely. It was simply a direction they had agreed to move in, and they both understood it, and the understanding settled between them, like something that had always been there, and was only now being named. In the spring, when the first mild evenings arrived, Cecily, who had been Cecily Hartfield, and was still the Duchess of Aldermere, and would in time be something else she had not yet decided how to name, unlocked the garden door at the back of the townhouse and stood for a while in the cool air. There were no lavender beds here. It was a London garden, not a Gloucestershire one. The smell was box hedge and damp stone, and faintly, something flowering somewhere in the square beyond the wall. Edmund was beside her. He had not proposed in any formal way. He had said 3 weeks earlier, with his particular quality of plain honesty, I would like to marry you, if you are willing, when the mourning period is concluded, and you have had time to be certain. She had said she was willing. They had told Mr. Prewet. Mr. Prewet had said, with the gravity of a man for whom such occasions were never small, I am very glad, Your Grace. The season would say what it said. The season always said things, Cecily had found, in the past months, that the season's saying was considerably less frightening once you understood that you did not require its approval, only its attention, which was a different thing entirely. Edmund put his hand over hers, where it rested on the gate. Not the pressing urgency of a first touch. Not the tentative approach of something new. Something quieter and more particular. The way a thing settles when it finally finds the place it was always intended to occupy. She turned her hand beneath his so that their palms met. The evening light came over the garden wall and lay flat across the stone, and somewhere in the city, the early spring was continuing, unmoved by either of them. And in her parlor, the fire had burned to a steady, warm base, and the chess set sat on the table with the correspondence beside it, and Mrs. Aldous had gone home at 4 o'clock and would return tomorrow morning, and the house was quiet in the way that houses are quiet when they have decided they are content with their occupant. Cecily had been Miss Hartfield. She had been Lady Aldermere. She had been, in the long dark interval, a woman waiting without knowing what she was waiting for. She was not waiting now. If this story moved you, do share it with someone who knows what it is to find their way back to something they believed was lost. Thank you for staying until the end. She turned to look at Edmund, and he was looking at her, and the evening held them both, and the gate was open.